Hey all, I'm Bob the OT. Now, in my last video I was looking at the legality of going to war, but this can be quite complicated, and so I thought I'd try to contextualise it with this video. In my lessons, more often than not, the students want to know whether the Iraq war was legal, and so I thought that that could be a really good topic for this video. Now this is going to be really contentious, and so throughout this video I want you to bear in mind that these are just my views. We're going to try and look at each of the issues that we discussed in my last video, but we'll start with the gold-plated solution, which is whether or not a United Nations Security Council resolution was in force. Well, already we run into complications. In 1991, and following the first Gulf War, United Nations Security Resolution 687 was implemented. This stated that there must be an unconditional destruction of all the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq held. And importantly, it said that such further steps as may be required for the implementation of this present resolution may be enacted. And this is just boring legalese speak for war is okay. Unusually for a resolution of this kind, though, there was no time frame given. But 12 years had passed between then and trying to then go back into Iraq. And this was quite a long period of time, and so it's probably better to get another resolution. In 2002, Resolution 1441 was passed. This stated that the inspectors from the IAEA should have full access to investigate whether or not Iraq was producing weapons of mass destruction. It lacked that phrase that I said before. And immediately after it was passed, China and Russia both made it clear that they thought that a second resolution would be required if we were to go to war. Whereas the US and the UK both said that, actually as far as they were concerned, it was fine. This was giving them permission to use Resolution 687 to deploy forces. And here we come into one of the real issues that I see relating to the UNSC. And that's that although you only need 9 countries of the 15 members to pass a resolution, if any one of the 5 permanent members veto it, then it can't take place. I don't know whose damn stupid idea it was to allow these countries to have a veto, especially when they don't see eye to eye in many issues. But this meant that a second resolution could be quite difficult. However, the US did try to push for one initially, only for France to say that it would veto any resolution calling for war. As such, the US decided to pull this resolution before it went to a vote, based on the idea that actually it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. With all this in mind, I think it's quite tricky to say whether or not there really was a resolution allowing an invasion. So let's just give this a question mark. Okay, so what about opinio juris? Well, the Bush Doctrine following 9/11 can be seen to be really quite reasonable. Saddam was a dangerous leader, and he had an oppressive regime that had a history of genocide and had a history of using chemical weapons. Furthermore, al-Zarqawi was creating sleeper cells in Iraq. With this in mind, and casting our minds back to the atmosphere of post 9/11, I think that we should be able to give ticks to each of Bush's doctrinal concepts, although acknowledging that there really were issues with them. So, does this give the invasion of Iraq moral legitimacy? Well, this is another real grey area, unfortunately. Yes, Zarqawi was developing sleeper cells, but this was in response to the increasingly hawkish nature of the Bush regime. Also, Iraq wasn't asking for help or actively supporting the terrorists, So at this stage, Article 2 of the UN Charter can't really be applicable. There is, of course, the fact that Article 2 could be applied if there were weapons of mass destruction threatening America or Britain. But if we're going to use that logic, then even at that time, the CIA identified Iran and North Korea as being a greater threat. So why not challenge them instead? So was Bush just trying to get involved to complete the job that his father had started? Well, possibly. Another point that everybody brings up is that it was all about oil. Now, okay, the Western economy is reliant on oil. And Iraq has the dubious privilege of owning 10% of the world's oil reserves and 5% of US oil imports. It also had this nasty tendency of switching off the oil supplies on the whim of its dictator. From America's perspective, there was also the issue that in 2000 it changed from floating the oil markets using the dollar to the euro, and there was real concern that other OPEC countries would follow suit. But if we're going to start talking about oil being the main reason for going to war, then we should also apply that same logic to those that opposed going to war. Now, yes, oil reserves were opened up to the West since the invasion. And it's true that the most aggressive US and UK lobbyists pre the invasion have had the biggest contracts since. But although France did say that war was the worst solution, causing incalculable consequences for this scarred and fragile region, it was also the largest trading partner of Iraq at that time. And Total, the French company, was poised to reap the benefit once its sanctions had been lifted. Furthermore, Total was in negotiations with Chinese and Russian oil firms for post-sanction development. So they stood to gain an awful lot financially from no invasion occurring. Now, into this complex geopolitical situation, you've also got to throw in the will of the people. And prior to the invasion of Iraq, the globe saw some of the world's largest ever mass protests against this invasion. This can lead to an awful lot of people thinking that the war couldn't have been legitimate. And yet it's not as simple as all that. From Britain's perspective at least, the House of Commons, Britain's Parliament, voted for the invasion. And so, whether you liked the invasion or not, it did have legitimacy in that regard. With all this in mind, can we really say whether or not the invasion of Iraq was morally legitimate? I don't think we can, and I'm afraid I think we're going to have to just give another question mark to this category. Okay, so what of the Blair Doctrine? Well, in the international community, it seems to have more legitimacy than Bush's doctrine. But could it be applied to the Iraq invasion? Well, yes, there were definitely clear reasons for going to war. And after 9/11, Tony Blair made it clear that we would stand shoulder to shoulder with our US allies. That being said, we were adamant that we didn't want regime change. Were national interests involved? Well, yes. Britain has deep historical ties to Iraq. But more than this, there were also concerns that Iraq had the potential to launch weapons within 45 minutes. Furthermore, there was intelligence saying that Iraq was trying to obtain uranium from Africa. On the flip side of this, though, it has come to light that the government was over-egging the pudding, and the dossier that talks about all these issues has since become known as the Sexed Up dossier. With this in mind, really we can't apply Article 2 at all. So let's put a cross by that. But let's go back to Blair's doctrine. Were there sensible military options? To give Blair the benefit of the doubt, we have to acknowledge that General Pickett had set up a working group in the MOD. But with the increasing need for weapons of mass destruction to be found as they started to build their case to go into Iraq, the focus started to change in all the planning assumptions. Furthermore, at the 11th hour, Turkey refused forces to use its territory, and so planning became rushed and even more uncoordinated. Additionally, even at that time, the UK armed forces knew that they would be overstretched. And due to their commitments to Afghanistan, it meant that the British Army would not be able to commit meaningfully to Iraq. With this in mind, I think we're going to have to give a red cross for sensible military options. What about whether all diplomatic and peaceful options were attempted? In Chalcott's inquiry, his report came to the conclusion that they weren't all exhausted. However, this must be subjective. By 2002, there had been 18 UNSC resolutions passed. These had all been ignored by Saddam Hussein, and so just how long would we allow Saddam to keep on playing the international system? I think, with this in mind, it's only fair to really give a green tick and say that yes, all sensible, peaceful options had been exhausted. Which brings us to the final point. Were we prepared for the long term? Well, no, not a chance were we. And the Chilcot report is particularly damning on this issue. Not only were we not prepared for the long term, but despite Britain's best efforts, the US were still insistent on dismantling Iraq's security forces. This weakened an already terribly fragile state, and it was directly linked to the subsequent rise of ISIS and the issues that we see today. Prepared for the long term needs to get a big red cross. So, let's look at this table. On balance, was it legal to go into Iraq? Well, despite the awful outcomes, there are just too many grey areas, and I think it depends upon our biases. I think that if you believe that we went into a war with Iraq for oil, you're going to see this as being an illegal conflict. On the flip side, if you believe that Iraq was a dangerous regime that was a threat to Western security, then you're going to see this as a legal conflict, because there are so many grey areas and it's a matter of choice. With that in mind, I'm going to sit on the fence and say it'll be over to you. So, thanks for listening to this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you got something from it. Please click subscribe to find out when I post more videos, and I look forward to seeing you next time.